Tonight we're going to do capitalism versus socialism. This is an important lesson because we still believe in socialism. We're still practicing it all over the world. It's a failure formula. It doesn't work because you're dealing with human nature, and we'll talk after. I'm going to show a 45-minute film called Heaven on Earth. And after the film, we're going to discuss this. We're probably going to go after 8:30 because I need at least 2 hours to discuss. We'll go a little bit past 8:30. But I want to read you something from, before we start the film, from Business Week this month. Americans love democracy and freedom so long as there's no quiz involved. The numbers are depressing. 1 in 4 Americans don't know that the United States declared its independence from England. 1 in 3 cannot name a single branch of government, and 3 in 4 can't say why the Civil War was fought. Late-night comedians and plenty of others have had fun shining a light on the dark corners of the American brain. And when faced with such obliviousness, it's surely better to laugh than cry. Better yet would be to do something about it. More than 90% of students take a civics class in high school, but on the national test given in 2010, only 27% of high school seniors demonstrated proficiency in the subject. A core purpose of public education is to prepare young people not only for college and careers, but also for the responsibilities that come with citizenship, including voting. Schools require students to meet basic standards in math and English. The same should be true of civics. This Sunday, in the Mail Tribune, there are going to be 2 articles on the book American Pageant that was just accepted by the schools in the Medford School District. And my part will be against the book, and somebody's going to write for the book. I suggest you would read that. We are doing the same things that are causing 27% of the students to know history. And the history that they know is not good history either. We need to teach the greatness of America and then explain what's happened. It's taken me 40 years to put this together. We're not teaching this anymore. We're teaching all the flaws and what's wrong. So then when we come up for answers, like should we be negotiating with a terrorist nation, we don't know the answers. We don't know the answers to these things. What are the powers of the president? What are the powers of Congress? What are the powers of the judiciary? We've forgotten our moorings, and therefore this is the only kind of government that's been invented this way in the history of man. There's no other government like this. So we're going to show this film, Capitalism versus Socialism. And where did the term capitalism come from? Before I sit down and show you the film. Where's capitalism come from? That term. We use that all the time. That's Marx. I'm Marx too, but he's spelled with an X. I don't spell my name with an X.
Thank goodness.
He came up with that term, and it was kind of in a derogatory way. It wasn't in a positive way. Well, okay, everybody practices capitalism, but it depends where the capital is. Who's got control of the capital? See, that's what we're talking about. Okay, so we're going to see this film for 45 minutes, and then we're going to talk about a Scotsman that we've forgotten, but we haven't forgotten, and we're going to talk about it. Okay, now 45 minutes.
Age. It promised a world of harmony and abundance, if only property was shared by all and distributed equally. The idea was called socialism. and it spread farther and faster than any religion in history. Then, in almost the blink of an eye, it all collapsed. What happened? In this series, we trace the rise and fall of an idea that changed the world. An idea that promised a heaven right here on Earth.
The early 19th century brought with it a faith in limitless human progress. Old beliefs rooted in religion and superstition were abandoned in favor of new ones, supposedly based on science and rational thought. One of these new ideas was called socialism. Hello, I'm Ben Wattenberg. Welcome to Heaven on Earth, a think tank special. In this hour, a British reformer creates a model utopia on the American frontier. Soon, two German philosophers recast the idea as prophecy, arguing that socialism is the world's destiny. And as the 20th century begins, a Russian revolutionary sets out to fulfill the prophecy at any cost, including mass murder, while peaceful reformers across Europe and North America respond very differently to socialism's call. And so we begin in America. The United States is not yet 50 years old. Land in the West is plentiful, a magnet to new settlers and to new ideas.
Indiana, 1825. A great experiment was unfolding on the banks of the Wabash River. It was called New Harmony, and it would be a community of equality, heralding a new way of life, and eventually a new kind of world. Its founder was a British industrialist named Robert Owen, and his followers would soon coin a name for his vision: socialism. When Robert Owen arrived in America, he was already famous for his progressive ideas. His cotton mill in New Lanark, Scotland, was the most heralded industrial enterprise of its day. He shortened working hours, restricted child labor, and even provided sick pay. And Owen not only cared about how his 2,000 employees worked, he cared about how they lived.
Anyone who would live in his properties there at New Lanark had to live by his rules, and they were very specific. How often they had to put out their trash, how often they had to bathe, when people needed to be home at night, the fact that they couldn't be publicly drunk, they had to spend time with their families, those kinds of things.
Education was a key part of Owen's reforms. Rather than putting his employees' children to work in the factory, he put them in school. He also created the first preschool in the United Kingdom. It was part of what he called the Institute for the Formation of Character. Owen was developing a theory of human nature that would remain one of the fundamental ideas of socialism. It would resurface again and again.
He felt you could actually mold human character, and he in fact said it is of all truths the most important that man's character is made for, not by himself. So he's an environmental determinist, and he believes that if you can begin virtually at birth and have this child in a superior environment, then you will, through education and liberation of this person's intellect and spirit, you will actually produce a perfect character.
He called this the second coming of the truth. I think he really did believe he was the second Messiah, that he had come, unlike Jesus, who could only tell the truth in parables. Owen, on the other hand, could actually say the literal truth, because he had the science.
People took Owen seriously. When he arrived in America in 1825, a joint session of Congress was convened to hear his ideas. Before an audience that included President James Monroe and President-elect John Quincy Adams, Owen announced he had purchased an entire village in Indiana. There, he would further the work begun at New Lanark. But this time, his community would be one of true equality. Harmony, Indiana was founded a decade earlier as a different kind of commune, a religious one. Owen bought it from George Rapp, the charismatic leader of a sect of German Lutherans who were pulling up stakes to follow one of Rapp's visions. They left behind 160 buildings and some 30,000 acres of fertile land.
If you think of Indiana at that time period, it was the wilderness. And here in the middle of the wilderness, you had this beautiful town of brick and clapboard houses, a magnificent cruciform church in the middle of town in the commons. It was very sophisticated. It was called the Athens of the West at that time.
On April 27, 1825, Robert Owen welcomed 800 eager arrivals to the town he had rechristened New Harmony. One group in particular was attracted to New Harmony: intellectuals. The village soon became a center of progressive thought and experiment.
You had education at all levels, from infant to adult education. You had a newspaper being published. You had natural scientists out exploring the environs of New Harmony and beyond, creating natural science books to show people about the wonderful new species they're finding in the Midwest. You had people lecturing about equal rights for women. You had people lecturing about abolition. This was in 1827, 1828.
To coincide with the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence in July 1826, Owen issued what he saw as the next step in the liberation of humankind: the Declaration of Mental Independence. From here forward, he proclaimed, man was free from the trinity of evils responsible for all the world's misery and vice: traditional religion, conventional marriage, and private property. The last of these was key. The quest to do away with private property would animate socialism for the next 150 years.
I think that Robert Owen arrived slowly at the conclusion that it was individual property and individual profit that was, in a sense, undermining the opportunities to create a new society. That inequalities in society were created by inequalities in the ownership of property and in the ownership of wealth and profit.
Owen couldn't quite bring himself to turn over ownership of his property to the community, but people did get to live there for free. All goods were distributed at the village store. It was not the most efficient system. One New Harmony member named Paul Brown wrote that even salads were deposited in the store to be handed out, making 10,000 unnecessary steps and causing them to come to the tables in a wilted, deadened state. Before long, many members were losing their enthusiasm for the experiment.
In the end, I think one of the problems in New Harmony was that It was a big group of idealists in one place, in a very isolated place. They spent a lot of time thinking about the ideal of the perfect community. Ultimately, you had a lot of thinkers and not enough doers.
The work simply didn't get done. Before long, industries that had thrived under George Rapp's followers were either sputtering or out of business altogether. After 2 years, several reorganizations, and 7 different constitutions, Owen's great experiment collapsed.
Owen had a very hard time acknowledging that there was a failure at New Harmony, and through a period of many months when everyone around him, including his sons, was saying things are falling apart, Owen was saying things are going great here. But eventually he couldn't keep up that pretense any longer because everyone was leaving. And so Owen found a kind of alibi, I think, in blaming the people who came to New Harmony as being poor human material for his experiment.
Owen's son Robert Dale stayed at New Harmony after its collapse. He had a different assessment of his father's experiment. He wrote, "All cooperative schemes which provide equal remuneration to the skilled and industrious and the ignorant and idle must work their own downfall. For by this unjust plan, they must of necessity eliminate the valuable members and retain only the improvident, unskilled, and vicious." Despite the failure of New Harmony and other early attempts to put socialism into practice, the idea continued to generate great excitement. Soon, 2 philosophers would take utopian hope and turn it into faith by arguing that socialism was not only desirable, it was inevitable. Back in England, Robert Owen and his followers were building gathering places for the socialist faithful. They called them halls of science. Each week, thousands of adherents of Owen's new moral world flocked there seeking inspiration.
Even though they proclaimed earnestly that they had contempt for all religion, every Sunday they would all gather and bring their families there, but they didn't call them services, they called them meetings, and then someone would get up in the front and do something that sounded like a sermon, but they called it a lecture, and then they would all sing from a special book of socialist hymns, except they wouldn't sing about God and goodness, they would sing about equality and brotherhood.
In 1843, the Manchester congregation included a 22-year-old German journalist and radical named Friedrich Engels. For a young man rebelling against the faith of his parents, the services held a great appeal.
Engels was a bit of a rebel, I think. He was the typical frat boy in many ways. He was very interested in the military, he was interested in sports, he loved pubs, he loved women. But he was also an intellectual. He was in many ways the kind of person you would immediately recognize as a leader and as somebody people would congregate around.
Back in Germany, Engels had fallen in with a radical crowd, and his father was desperate to getting away from the bad influence of his friends.
His father gets this idea that he should send Fred off to England, to Manchester, where the family business had a branch, and much to his relief, Fred agrees. Little does Dad know that Fred and his radical associates have come to the conclusion that the revolution is going to break out in England, and Fred is desperate to be there to be part of the action.
Once in Manchester, Engels threw himself into writing what would become a famous study of the English working class during the Industrial Revolution.
It was a very grim picture. I mean, workers in the 1840s in England, they lived miserable lives. They lived in squalid conditions. They worked 16, 18 hours a day. Child labor, female labor was incredibly common. Disease was rampant. The living standards were just below probably what we would even expect in many underdeveloped countries today. It was a miserable, miserable time.
Engels saw that the working class was miserable, and at the same time he was also envisioning a sort of salvation of the working class in terms of history providing a fertile ground for revolution. He understood that the workers sooner or later would understand that history was working in their favor, and therefore history would radicalize them. And by being radicalized, workers would no longer passively see themselves as victims of capitalism, but would actively seek to change it.
Engels was soon contributing to Owen's New Moral World and other radical publications. Among them was a newspaper edited by a man who had once been part of young Fred's circle of college radicals back in Germany, the 25-year-old Karl Marx.
Marx, starting very young, was very charismatic. He had this forbidding style and this great genius for theoretics, where other people saw a meaning, Marx could see a meaning within a meaning, behind a meaning, and then a bigger meaning. And his colleagues would just look at him awestruck and say, this is our great genius who can figure it all out.
Marx had little use for the ideas of his colleagues, but one of Engels' articles caught his eye. The two men began corresponding, and in the summer of 1844 they arranged to meet in Paris. It was the beginning of one of the most intellectually fruitful partnerships in history.
Marx was the prophet. His personality and his nature made him a flamboyant and charismatic figure, and Engels was very willing to defer to that. But Engels' early work and early research really provides much of the foundation upon which Marxism is later built. And Engels, of course, also supports Marx not only through his research, but financially and psychologically. And so without Engels, in any number of ways, Marxism would never have come to be.
In January 1848, students and workers took to the streets of Palermo. By February, the revolt had spread to Paris. Soon, nearly 50 uprisings engulfed the European continent from Russia to the English Channel. Marx and Engels rushed home to Germany to join the barricades. They had just finished writing a platform for a workers' organization based in London. The pamphlet would become known as the Communist Manifesto. The manifesto's timing would forever link it to revolution, adding to its mystique. Soon the world would learn the central premise of Marxism, that the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles.
For Marx and Engels, the heart of the system of capitalism was exploitation. As they saw it, the workers were the ones who were creating the things that were coming out of the factories, but the capitalists were the ones who were keeping most of the profits. What they talked about were the means of production, the Marxist term for the machinery, the factories, and this was terribly unjust. And the only way to rectify it was for the workers to get together and take the factories away from the capitalists so that they could have the complete benefit of the products that they themselves were creating.
The Communist Manifesto predicted that as capitalism progressed, the working class would become so large and so poor that revolution would be inevitable. The result, socialism, a new workers' state where people contributed according to their ability and received according to their need. In time, government itself would become unnecessary, and give way to a new stateless society Marx and Engels called communism.
What Marx and Engels said was, don't worry, whatever happens to you, no matter how miserable your lives are, no matter how desperate your political struggle seems, history is working its way towards this outcome. And that's what gives Marxism its incredible force.
Many socialists bought the argument. The Communist Manifesto would go on to become one of the most influential pamphlets ever published, with translations in every major European language by the turn of the century. But the manifesto was just a summary. Marx soon set to work on a volume that would lay out a comprehensive theory of socialism. In 1851, Marx wrote to Engels that he hoped to finish it in 5 weeks. But 5 weeks grew into 5 years, and then another and another 5. All the while, Marx depended almost entirely on Engels for financial support.
The one time Marx went out and got an actual job was as a correspondent for the New York Tribune newspaper. But he didn't speak English, and so he couldn't write the articles himself. Engels did speak English, and he got Engels to ghostwrite the articles for a number of years until he got his own English up to a level where he could write some himself.
It took Marx nearly 20 years to finish his masterwork. In 1867, the first volume of Das Kapital was finally complete, with more volumes promised. The book would soon be hailed as a breakthrough in political and economic thought.
In the scientific tenor of the time, after all, we have to understand that we're talking about the 19th century here, Marx had accomplished, at least in the mind of many socialists, what Darwin had accomplished for biology. He had laid bare the development of economic laws that were at work in capitalism. And in that sense, he had revealed the motor of history, economic development.
And it is to Marx still that we owe this kind of economic view of history, as seeing people as sort of players in a drama in which economic forces are primary, and classes more than individuals as the kind of motor force of history.
Engels survived Marx by 12 years. Thanks in large part to his public relations work, Marxism spread to workers' movements in Germany and across Europe. But by the time Engels died in 1895, many of the more perceptive socialists were beginning to notice a crack in Marxist doctrine.
By the end of the 19th century, Marxist theory has been around for about 50 years. But it's not coming true. The workers are not getting poorer, and they're not becoming revolutionary. And at that point, there's sort of a choice. You can say, well, I'm for the workers and never mind the revolution, but we'll try to make things a little better step at a time. Or you can say, I'm for the revolution, that's what's going to give us the glorious new society, and if the workers aren't going to make the revolution, why, we'll find someone else to make it.
As the 19th century drew to a close, 2 very different men would step up to make the case for each of these options. It would rupture the movement in 2. The rapid rise of socialism in Germany frightened the country's rulers. In 1878, Chancellor Otto von Bismarck outlawed all socialist activities, driving many members of the Social Democratic Party into exile. Among them was a young bank clerk named Edward Bernstein. He soon became editor of the party's clandestine newspaper, first in Switzerland and then in London.
When Bernstein goes to England, he becomes acquainted with Marx and Engels, and Marx and Engels become very enamored of him. And after Marx dies, Engels asks Bernstein if he will put together from Marx's notes a 4th volume of Capital. And when Engels dies, he also is asked to be one of the executors of Engels' will. So he was very closely tied to Marx and Engels and seen in the period after their death as one of the most important international socialists.
But Bernstein lived in a very different era from that of his mentors. Standards of living were changing, just not in the way Karl Marx had predicted. It wasn't long before Bernstein began to question his Marxist faith.
I think that he thought that capitalism was evolving along the lines of becoming more and more inclusive of the working class. And he had some empirical evidence that showed that the working class was not getting poorer, and it showed that, therefore, the Marxist vision, somehow, something was wrong with it.
Bernstein decided he had to face his doubts. I said to myself, he wrote, this cannot go on. It is idle to try to reconcile the irreconcilable. What is necessary is to become clear just where Marx is right and where he is wrong. Bernstein's critique became known as revisionism, and it stirred up an urgent debate among socialists around the world.
Bernstein said that what usually is understood to be the final goal of socialism is nothing to me. The movement is everything. That really caused consternation in the party, because people thought that Bernstein had given up the great goal, and the great goal of socialism, as we know, of course, was the breakdown of capitalism, and Bernstein was no longer interested in, or did no longer believe in the breakdown of capitalism. And if that's the case, then Bernstein actually was no longer a Marxist socialist, and if that's the case, it's as though the Pope in Rome was no longer a Catholic.
Thousands of miles away, a 29-year-old Siberian exile was carefully following the debate. His eventual response to Bernstein's criticisms would forever change the face of socialism. His name, Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, better known by his nom de guerre, Lenin.
Lenin was, first of all, probably Russia's most exuberant workaholic in a country that did not have a work ethic. He was enormously hardworking. He was enormously smart. He had supreme self-confidence and a belief that he really knew what was right for everybody, and particularly for the future of his country.
When Vladimir was 17, his older brother Sasha was executed for plotting to assassinate Tsar Alexander III. It was the beginning of his own path to revolutionary action.
After he got to the university, he took part in a demonstration, which was not political. It was directed against some regulations of the university. When he was arrested, and it was discovered that he was the younger brother of the executed terrorist, he was expelled from the university. He was a top student, so he had to spend several years in idleness.
Vladimir was banished to his family's country estate. There he began to explore the stacks of radical literature his executed brother had left behind.
He read various Russian revolutionaries, read Karl Marx, and began to come to the conclusion that it was just as important as his brother had thought to create a new social system for Russia. That revolutionaries had to learn to toughen themselves, to make themselves into heroes who were going to give their all to save Russia, something like his brother had done.
Vladimir's revolutionary activity would lead to deeper trouble with the law. By the time he heard about Edward Bernstein's writings nearly a decade later, he was in exile yet again, this time in Siberia. His life now revolved around one goal: revolution.
Lenin was an individual who was often in a state of rage. That was his personality, but he was infuriated by Bernstein. But unlike a lot of the others, Lenin in effect realized that Bernstein was right, that the workers were not becoming revolutionary.
When Lenin returned from exile, his younger brother met him at the train station. Dmitry Ulyanov would later recall the first topic on his brother's lips, the need to refute Bernstein. Lenin soon laid out a radically different idea of what to do if the workers wouldn't make the revolution.
He developed quite early on what I would call a politics based on the absence of trust. So if you can't then trust the workers to make a revolution, whom can you trust? And Lenin said the only people you can trust are full-time professional revolutionaries like himself, who will make a revolution in the name of the people.
Lenin, in effect, said, heck with the workers, the revolution is everything. Except Lenin wasn't quite that honest. He didn't say, heck with the workers. He said, we'll have to discover the vanguard of the workers, or of the proletariat, and that will be, well, me and my pals, and we'll make the revolution for the workers.
For Lenin, this was more than just a theory. In 1900, he left for Europe to start an underground newspaper, Iskra, or Spark, to ignite a new revolutionary movement in Russia. In the summer of 1914, 50 years of peace in Europe came to a bloody end. Soon the entire continent was mired in the fiercest conflict the world had yet seen. The Great War hit Russia particularly hard.
There was a breakdown of transport. There was inflation. And in the northern cities, particularly the capital city of St. Petersburg, or Petrograd as it was then called, there were great shortages of food and fuel. So the winter was very, very harsh.
By early 1917, the ground was crumbling beneath the Tsarist regime. As Russian troops battled Germany in the west, strikes and protests spread across the country. Then, in Petrograd, a group of soldiers mutinied. It was the beginning of what became known as the February Revolution. To prevent a similar uprising on the front, the Tsar abdicated the throne. Power fell into the hands of a liberal provisional government.
There was a kind of chaos and anarchy that grew very quickly in Russia after the February Revolution, after the emperor had abdicated. Land was being seized by peasants. Villages were declaring their independence and sewing their own flags. And you have the idea that whatever the bonds, the glue that will hold a society together, fear, loyalty, tradition, it somehow melted away and evaporated, with Russia crumbling into the smallest parts.
Many Russian socialists welcomed the new liberal government, but not Lenin. He had lived in exile in Europe for most of the past 15 years, sometimes traveling in disguise. All the while, he had worked to strengthen and arm a new party in Russia, the Bolsheviks, even ordering bank robberies and extortion to finance party activities. Now he saw the chance he had been waiting for. On October 25th, 1917, the Bolsheviks struck. This is a later Soviet reenactment of Lenin's men storming the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg. In reality, the revolution was much less dramatic. The provisional government yielded with little bloodshed. Many didn't expect the new regime to hold on to power any longer than the provisional government had.
When Lenin and the Bolsheviks seized power, they really were a tiny minority. And immediately, the Bolshevik regime found itself embroiled in a civil war, which it won militarily, but it also won because the Bolsheviks had been very successful in their use of propaganda to win what we might nowadays call the hearts and minds of the Russian people.
Through posters, leaflets, and speeches, Lenin tried to convince Russians of just who were the enemies of the people and who were their saviors. But Lenin didn't stop with propaganda. The enemies of the people were marked for retribution, including priests, rich peasants, and political opponents. Lenin began with Nicholas II, the last Tsar to reign over Russia.
Him, his wife, their 5 children, the doctor, the servants were all massacred. Then their bodies were cut up and burned, and then what was remained was buried in a shaft, which was only discovered a few years ago. Then, in August of 1918, a revolutionary who felt that Lenin had betrayed the revolution took 2 shots at him and wounded him almost fatally. Whereupon Lenin and his henchmen agreed to carry out Red Terror. This was a terrible thing. And people were taken out of prison where they were put political prisoners who had never been tried, had done nothing against the Bolsheviks, and just summarily shot. And this shooting went on. Hundreds of people were shot at night.
Many others found themselves banished to forced labor camps. Under Joseph Stalin, the system would become known as the Gulag.
A part of the Red Terror was the gathering of all opposition members into concentration camps outside of major cities. And these were the very first camps, and it was from these camps that the entire Gulag system developed. So they are very much a precursor to what came later in Stalin's time.
The Tsar had been reviled as a tyrant for executing a handful of violent radicals. Under Lenin and his followers, millions would die at the hands of the state.
It's difficult to calculate how many people came to die under Lenin's system and then Stalin's system because there were so many different ways to die. There were people who died in camps. There were people who died because they were machine gunned down in the woods. There were people who died because they were deported. There were people who died in artificial famines. When you begin to put the numbers together, you get statistics in the tens of millions.
Lenin, in general, had no sympathy for human beings such as they were. He believed, as did others, that through education, legislation, you can make people not want to own things. You create new human beings. So the existing human race was so rotten that killing them was actually progressive.
Amidst terror and war, Lenin was building a system of government unlike any seen before. Along with the old regime, Russia's capitalist industries, the banks, and the church were all completely destroyed. Replacing them all was a single institution, the party. Most of the Bolsheviks had no experience in business or administration, yet they drew up a plan to manage a country with the world's 5th largest economy and its 3rd largest population. The results were a far cry from heaven on earth.
By 1920, in some ways you can say that civil society and civilization had stopped. There was massive famine. The industry had broken down, the railroads stopped working, the economy had fallen apart, and people were really reverting to the most primitive kind of bartering. Massive loss of life. It was a nightmare.
By now, Russia was officially known as the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. The Bolsheviks called themselves communists. That term had long been interchangeable with socialism, but it took on a very new meaning as Lenin broke all ties with the rest of the world's socialists and formed a new international movement. He had big plans for his revolution.
And Lenin said more than once that he never believed that the revolution could be confined to Russia. The revolution had to spread. It had to spread to the industrial countries of the West. First of all, Germany, Great Britain, ultimately the United States, and so on.
In the Marxist scheme of things, the most advanced capitalist country was the one that was supposed to be transformed first, and that was the United States of America. But ironically, socialism never gained the popularity in America that it gained in almost all other countries, basically because its main constituency, or supposed constituency, the working class, the labor unions, simply didn't accept it. They wrestled with it for a while and then rejected it.
In America, the split between trade unions and socialists goes all the way back to the very beginnings of the organized labor movement in the late 19th century. Spurred by Marx and Engels, workers' movements across Europe were gaining strength, and most were embracing socialism as their guiding philosophy. In America, too, workers were organizing, but they would choose a very different path. Led by a straight-talking cigar maker named Samuel Gompers.
The irony about Sam Gompers is that he was a Marxist who forged an anti-Marxist labor movement. Gompers was born in a poor family in London and moved to the United States in his teens, becomes a skilled cigar maker. And all this time, he is a socialist. He's reading Marx, he's reading Engels, he's reading other classics of European socialism. And he believes that the best way to organize workers to demand their emancipation, the best way to achieve socialism is by making the trade unions themselves stronger.
Gompers rejected the idea that workers needed radical intellectuals to help them achieve their goals. I saw that betterment for working men must come primarily through working men, he wrote. I saw the danger of entangling alliances with intellectuals who did not understand that to experiment with the labor movement was to experiment with human life. Gompers and his allies favored something called pure and simple unionism. It meant using strikes and boycotts to fight for better pay and benefits rather than taking political action to create a whole new system. In 1886, Gompers helped found the American Federation of Labor, uniting individual unions across the country. As the AFL's first president, his salary would be less than he earned rolling cigars. Gompers' leadership of American workers would be challenged by socialists within and without the AFL. In 1901, some of these socialists came together to form the Socialist Party of America. At the party's helm was a rival labor leader, a railway man named Eugene V. Debs.
Debs is a fascinating figure because he's one of these perennial candidates who runs for president 5 times as a Socialist Party candidate. He achieves at most 6% of the vote, which he gets in 1912. But he's an enormously popular, charismatic figure, much more than Gompers ever was.
Originally, Gompers had hoped he and Debs would work together, but he ended up calling Debs the apostle of failure. He was involved with the Western Labor Union, then the American Labor Union, then the IWW, and Gompers felt any attempt to organize a rival trade union was, in effect, doing the employer's job to weaken the union. You then had union fighting union.
By 1903, the American Federation of Labor represented more than 1.5 million union members and was becoming a force to be reckoned with in American life. At that year's AFL convention, Gompers forever parted ways with his old allies. "I want to tell you, socialists," he said, "I have kept close watch upon your doctrines for 30 years, have been closely associated with many of you, and I want to say that I am entirely at variance with your philosophy. Economically, you are unsound, socially, you are wrong, industrially, you are an impossibility." Despite Gomper's opposition, the Socialist Party continued to gain strength. Surprisingly, the party drew more support from farmers than from industrial workers. One of the greatest centers of socialist support was Oklahoma. Eugene Debs won more than 16% of the presidential vote there in 1912. But America's entry to World War I brought a turning point for the party.
World War I, socialists in this country and around the world have to decide, will they support their individual nations in the war, or will they support the International Socialist Brotherhood and oppose the war of workers against other workers? And the American Socialist Party, unlike most of the European socialist parties, decides to oppose the U.S. government and to oppose World War I. And most trade unionists, Gompers as their leader, support the war.
The more moderate socialists leave the party and actually work with Gompers in the AFL. The more radical socialists start speaking out against the war, and they are arrested. Eugene Debs gets arrested in 1918, gets sentenced to 10 years in jail. And by the time he comes out of jail in 1921, when he's pardoned, the Socialist Party is pretty much a shell.
The party never regained its pre-war strength, not even during the Great Depression. Gompers and the American Federation of Labor, later the AFL-CIO, had won out as the principal voice of America's workers.
In many ways, Americanism proved to be a substitute for socialism for a lot of workers. After all, Americanism has always stood for the average person being able to make it. The American standard of living is something that all Americans should be able to enjoy. So the idea of class equality is something that undergirded the strength of socialism in Europe, but it's always been part of the American vision as well. So in many ways, Americanism trumped socialism and made socialism unnecessary as a vision for a lot of American workers.
Lights. Okay. All right. Now, you saw a little bit of the history. Wait a minute. Let's see if you can... Can you hear me now? Okay. You saw a little bit of the history mixed in. You saw what happens when socialism goes awry, when it gets to the next point, when it loses its steam. Socialism doesn't work because of why? In a nutshell, why doesn't socialism work? Gompers was involved with it for 30 years and said it does not work. Why doesn't it work? Yes?
Become too complacent and too lazy.
So human nature. Human nature is against it. It doesn't work. We're still doing it. It's very attractive. People are looking for utopia. There is no utopia here. If you want a utopia, it's not here. We're looking for a civilized society. We're looking for the best we can get. That's what we're looking for. If you keep looking for this perfection here of a society, it generally is not there. In New York City this morning, 8 million people woke up and had exactly enough Starbucks coffee to drink. Exactly enough orange juice with exactly enough vitamins to take. They consumed exactly enough bagels with more than enough cream cheese. They had exactly enough toothpaste as well as dental floss and toilet paper. Thank goodness. When they went to take a shower, there was exactly enough water for the populace in New York. There was exactly enough gas for transportation needs and exactly enough oil to lubricate their cars. exactly enough bread at the store, as well as exactly enough TVs to watch the morning news. There was exactly enough Wall Street journals, New York Times, and tires for trucks and automobiles. Everyone had exactly enough shoes, socks, undergarments, shirts, ties, and pants to go to work. There was exactly enough strawberries, raspberries, blueberries, pears, apples, dates, sugar, figs, and walnuts to put in exactly enough cold and hot cereal for breakfast for all. What caused this economic miracle that does not exist in Cuba? We now are having relations with Cuba. We're not going to look at the past and what they stand for and what they've done. It doesn't exist in North Korea. That scenario that I just read off in New York does not exist in Russia. It does not exist in Zimbabwe. It does not exist in Bangladesh, Syria, the Sudan, El Salvador, Pakistan, Iraq, Belarus, Rwanda, Afghanistan, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Nicaragua, Ethiopia, Lebanon, Gaza. I could go on. But it does exist here. Of course you've got poor. You've always had poor. But for the general populace, you have all of this surplus. What causes this to happen here and all of these other countries it does not happen? Well, I want to show you something, but first I want to talk about a great man. And then, Mary, we're going to see the thing on, I want David Walker for 4 minutes. He's the comptroller of the United States from 1998 to 2008. And I want to show you what he has to say about this. But first I want, Gail?
Just a question. It started in New Harmony, but it seems to have not died out. Right. And that's educating our children at a very young age. Take them away from their parents, put them in preschool, and it's just a short step of putting them into a government school.
Well, this is a great point that Gail makes. Socialism has been, even though it has proven to be a failure formula time and time again, it is very attractive because it looks like we can have equality of goods and services and production. But I don't know how many people are in here tonight. There's quite a few. Every one of you has a different intelligence. Every one of you has different talents. Every one of you has probably had different jobs, different opportunities in your life. And to rise to whatever you wanted to rise to, you could in this country. But you're not going to be equal. You're going to be equal in your opportunity most of the time. But that doesn't mean you're going to be equal in the results. And the utopians and those that are looking for this perfect society want equal results. It doesn't happen that way. And Gail said in New Harmony, that was in the 1920s, with Monroe and John Quincy Adams in the middle 1920s. But we're doing the same thing. We haven't learned the lessons because human nature, the form of government that we started, says the individual is the master. The individual has to do the work. The individual is the one that has to rise. Socialism wants to try to share everything, and they're sharing all the misery equally. And then if you move it out into a further on, you can get Marxism. Now I want to tell you, Marxism came here in the early 1920s, and it was taught in the colleges. Has anybody tried to read Das Kapital here? Well, don't try. I've already tried. Don't worry about it. Don't do it. This is the book you need to read. You know what this is? This is a Scotsman named Adam Smith who wrote a great book called The Wealth of Nations. This isn't read anymore. This is what this country's based on economically. You know when this was written?
1776.
When was it?
1776.
Yes, 1776. How do you like that? It's what?
I said there was another guy who wrote it before him. It was a Franciscan who wrote economics before he even did.
Who was it? Who was he?
It was a Franciscan priest out of Spain. He went who did the first economics before this.
Well, but Adam Smith put the whole formula together. And before he did this book, this was an experiment. The Wealth of Nations was an experiment. I'm going to read you parts of it. But the founding fathers of this country took a look at this. And Thomas Jefferson said this is the best book on economics extant. He used different language. We don't use that kind of language today. We use different kind of language. But before Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations, which is the basis for our economy, he wrote this: The Theory of Moral Sentiments. Well, what's that all about? Well, the theory of moral sentiments says that economics is a divine science, and natural law, the law from the divine creator, covers economics. The man who acts according to the rules of perfect prudence, of strict justice, and of proper benevolence may be said to be perfectly virtuous. But the most perfect knowledge of those rules will not alone enable him to act in this manner. His own passions are very apt to mislead him. In other words, you may know what the truth is of something, but because of your passions that you have, you may not, even though you know it's true, you may not do it. And then he goes on to say, sometimes to drive him and sometimes to seduce him, to violate all the rules which he himself, in all his sober and cool hours, approves of. The most perfect knowledge, if it is not supported by the most perfect self-command, will not always enable him to do his duty. So in other words, you may have the right knowledge, but if you don't have the right self-command, you can't do the knowledge that you have that's right. So he decided to set up an economic system that took this in consideration. And that's what the founders did with the country. They put in place a system that understood that there were two main things that we have to include in our documents. And what are those two main things? What did they write the system on the basis of? For instance, the Constitution. Well, one of them was what we just mentioned before, that young man over there talked about it. Human nature. We must have a system based on human nature. Socialism does not base it on socialism is against human nature. So Madison, when he spoke and talked in the Federalist Papers about how we're going to set up our government, he said we have to do it based on human nature. And Jefferson said we're going to bind them down with the chains, not with the Constitution, but with the chains of the Constitution. We're going to follow this strictly because we know if you go off of this, human nature goes in all directions, and it's got to be controlled. You have to be able to control human nature or you're going to lose what you're doing. So that's what the founders were doing. That's what Adam Smith was doing. And he wrote that book on moral sentiments before he even wrote The Wealth of Nations. Well, what was the world doing economically before this book was written? Now, the book is written in 1776. Three other great things, by the way. That was maybe the greatest year in the history of man. What other three things happened in 1776? You had The Wealth of Nations written. What else?
Declaration of Independence.
You had the Declaration of Independence. What else? There were two other things that were done in 1776 that just in the nick of time we got. And what were they? Well, these are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot shall in this crisis shrink from the service of their country. Who wrote that? Thomas Paine. That was called The Crisis, but he wrote Common Sense. Based on, it was a revolutionary idea to cause revolution, and it caused great, great angst in America. People were buying Common Sense, the pamphlet, and Thomas Paine really lit a fire under the American people. And not only that, Common Sense, Paine came across from Europe, and he was there just before they went into Trenton. He was fighting with Washington. How do you like that? And there was one other thing that happened that was very important in 1776.
I don't know if it's the one you're talking about, but Adam Weishaupt started the foundation for the New World Order.
That did happen in 1776, but I wasn't going to, that wasn't, that's true. That did happen. But I've got something else that fits in to what the founders were doing.
Had to bring it
Anybody
up.
know? The decline and fall of the Roman Empire by Edward Gibbon, telling you how society can progress and how it falls. And Edward Gibbon wrote that in 1776. First installment of it. How do you like that? So we had everything right there with us. And when Adam Smith came along, what was the idea for economics in the world?
Keynesian economics?
No, Keynes didn't come along till the 1900s. It was mercantilism. And mercantilism is you protect your own country, you have high tariffs. And Smith took a look at this, and he said that the differences in mercantilism, nation protects itself from massive imports through tariffs and duties, but still wants a high level of exports. And all the countries were doing this. He looked at that and said the doctrines of laissez-faire or free market economics require not only complete free trade, which we are not doing. You must have complete free trade. That's the way to do this. That's a moral idea. Drop the tariffs, let the goods come in. Who does that benefit anyway? Who does tariffs benefit? Like the steel tariffs we have. Well, it protects the steel industries. The steel industries here. But if you drop all that and you bring in, let's say Japan brings in computer chips. They dump a bunch of computer chips, and they're very cheap, but they're good. They work well. And Intel is going to have a problem because the labor they use for their computer chips, they have to hire people at much higher wages and so forth. So who benefits from that?
We do.
The consumer. The consumer benefits, and that's what this book is about. We want to benefit the consumer, not the producer, because the producers will try to protect themselves, they'll lobby, and they'll hoard out all competition if they can, and the consumers will not benefit from that. The consumers will have to pay. I'm not for buying American. I'm not for that. I'm for the consumer getting the best deal, the cheapest and best products they can get.
It would give them jobs.
What's that?
Well, if that's true, then if no one's having jobs here in the United States, how is that if it might be cheaper, but if they don't have any jobs here, how are they going to
Well, this is a great point.
How are they going to buy
Okay, let me explore that for just a minute. She says, well, if you do that, where are you going to have jobs here in America? Well, if those chips that I talked about come in, right, and a lot of Americans buy that, are jobs produced?
Well, if they don't have money to buy them, it doesn't.
Well, these are cheaper than Intel's chips.
I know.
People will buy it.
Yeah, I know, but they have to have an income to buy it.
Well, jobs will be produced, well, they got to have an income to buy Intel's chips too. Jobs will be produced.
How?
Because you have to have jobs in industry come in here. It's just like if you had Toyota come in here and they overtook Chrysler.
Yeah, but they have their manufacturing here now.
Well, who fills those jobs?
Well, Americans do.
Okay, then you're producing jobs.
Yeah.
Yes.
The way, I think what you're going after is not, in order for Intel to stay competitive with the foreign market coming in, they have to expand, otherwise they collapse.
Well, they have to expand, but they have to produce a product that is the American consumer wants to buy, is cheaper than the competition, but it's just as good or better. See, if you have, let's say you have Johnny here he's a lemonade, he sells lemonade, okay? And Johnny is very happy. See, that's a Van Gogh. Johnny's very happy because he has this stand, he has a lemonade stand, and he's got lemonade here. And guess what? Over here is IBM, an IBM factory, and all of these workers at lunchtime, they get really thirsty. And see, they go over here, and they get lemonade over here, and he's selling it for 25 cents a glass. Ooh, and that's good lemonade too. It's those hot days, you get that lemonade. Oh, it tastes so good. Delicious. So, this little Johnny, he's making a fortune over here because all these IBM workers are coming over here. And then all of a sudden, the director of and distributor of administrative services says, you know what? This young kid over here is making 25 cents a glass for lemonade. You know what? I'm going to get a Kachu machine. And I'm going to get, and people can buy this lemonade over here, and we've got strawberry, we've got pear lemonade, we've got the regular lemonade, but then we have other flavors over here, and guess what? In this machine, they can put 10 cents.
I knew you'd tell me.
10 cents in the machine, and they can get a thing of lemonade. What happens to Johnny? He's gone. He's out of a job. Unless what?
He improves.
He does what?
Improves.
He improves. He gets another, he goes to the bank, gets a loan, and gets another Kachu machine, and he sells it for 7 cents a glass, and he adds flavors or whatever he's going to do. Then he progresses. But that's what you're going to have to do. Yeah.
We've seen in the last 25 years the very thing that you're talking about. The Chinese have taken many of the jobs we used to do over here because of lower wages. And that's one of the reasons why the middle class is being pressed, is because what you're talking about is going on right now.
Well, but while that's going on, our unemployment is coming down.
But it isn't, because people are not applying.
But it's a different playing field now, though.
Well, the Chinese have never played on a level playing field.
No, they didn't. It's not a level. It is not a level playing field. But what I would suggest is we have never pursued the idea that complete free trade is the way to go. We've always had protectionism. We've had some kind of tariff. We've never lowered the tariff, had no tariffs at all, and just had complete.
You can't deny that the consumer has benefited from the transfer of jobs to China.
The consumer has benefited from the transfer of jobs to China?
Okay, for instance,
the consumer benefits when they can get something less. Now, see, China's a little different, though. First of all, as of today, they are not our biggest creditor.
We are.
No. Who's the biggest creditor for the United States?
Japan.
Japan is now. Japan just passed China. That's our biggest creditor. But what the American people want is the cheapest goods and the most you can make. Look, We used to have a horse and buggy. Okay? And then what happened? You had jobs. You got a lot of jobs there. People were riding horse and buggy. They're taking these milks. They're taking the ice. You got the ice guy that's coming to the door. Then all of a sudden, what happened?
It changed.
The automobile. So what happened to the horse and buggy? Gone. But that's an improvement. That's a good thing. That's what we want, see?
But you understand, if we didn't have the tariff on the motorcycle, like Harley and Davidson, if we hadn't put the tariff on the Yamaha, so they could have a chance to build up, so, and today now they are competitive with the Japanese. If we hadn't done something now, what do you say about that?
Well, I say that that's wrong.
Well, but they're a company and employing people now.
Well, if you have complete free trade, you're going to have goods coming to the United States, and you're going to have to compete. The American workers will have to compete with that, and you will have cheaper goods. They'll make that decision. Open up the market. Don't protect everything, because that's not the way to. Then you're protecting the producer. You don't want. You want the consumer to have the benefits.
Destroying our economy is government interference.
Yes.
Yeah,
there's too much government interference.
That's
Regulations,
true, I agree on that
taxes. I mean, you put all those things
Not
in there,
good.
people have to raise their prices.
Not good, and you have to, if you, that's what Hong Kong did. Hong Kong's got complete free trade. That's what they did.
The new Trans-Pacific Partnership that's yeah, but they also have the communist regime, that's their money making. Is going to royally screw America. I just watched a very lengthy interview this morning from a Democrat, and he is so adamantly against the new Trans-Pacific Partnership. And Obasco came on and said, oh, this is going to be a wonderful thing, but it's actually really going to undermine America.
Well, look, all of these things like that,
yeah, I know,
and steel tariffs that I mentioned, ethanol subsidies, that's all, you got to get rid of all that. But you can't now, it's so embedded, and you've got voting constituencies, but that's not Adam Smith anymore, see? That's not this anymore.
But the underlying statement is that it's the global corporations that are really majorly benefiting out of the TPP. That's right. I mean, they're going to get so many breaks out of this. You couldn't really survive as a small businessman trying to compete in the world, you know. If we lowered our lowered our corporation tax down from 35 to 15, it'd be a lot different, see? And
well, you have to do more than that.
Yeah.
You have to do a lot more than that.
But that's one of the things you have to do.
There's a lot of things that need to be done, but what, in the seventh lesson, we're going to say how we can restore America. And the first thing we have to do is sit down and talk things out. We've got to sit down and talk about where we are and how we can get to where we want to be. Not throwing sound bites, but discussing these things out. Now, I want to ask you a question. What's real wealth? What is wealth? And then I want to show something on greed. I want to show you something, and Mary's going to put it on. What's wealth? What would you consider wealth? Real wealth.
Money to take care of your needs.
It's what?
Enough money to take care of your needs.
Well, it's enough money to give what kind of needs? I mean, you have enough money to take care of your needs, but gold and silver isn't real wealth.
No. Joel, isn't labor real wealth?
Labor is part of it, but it's what it produces. For instance, food, schools,
but you
houses.
can't produce that without labor.
Yeah, you have to have labor to have that. Food, schools, houses, clothing, an abundance of goods produced as cheaply as possible with a certain standard of quality, which the consumer is free to decide. Adam Smith's key insight was that both parties to an exchange, all right, now here's the key. Both parties to an exchange can benefit And so long as the cooperation is strictly voluntary, no exchange will take place unless both parties benefit. Okay, you go to Albertsons, right? You go to Albertsons. And you buy a gallon of milk. Why did you do that? Why did you go to Albertsons and buy a gallon of milk? Well, you want it.
Nice
yeah,
store.
you want it, but you didn't go to.
Choice.
You could have gone to cost excuse me, 7-Eleven or Food for Less. Why'd you go to Albertsons?
Convenience.
Let's say you went to Albertsons, okay? You went to Albertsons and you bought a gallon of milk. Why'd you do that?
Like the ambience.
You like the ambience there. There's a nice clerk there. So
Yeah, right.
Why did you do that?
You've got customer loyalty that comes into play.
Well, you have customer loyalty, but there's more to it than that. That's true, but yeah.
Another is quality and convenience.
It's what?
Quality and convenience.
Quality and convenience.
And price.
All right, but what else is involved there? It's quality. It might be close to your house.
Close to your house.
Right? Might be convenient, but there's another reason why you did that.
Price.
Price.
You went and bought that milk.
For what reason?
Well, I'll get into it in a minute. You went there and bought that milk. First, you wanted it. Second of all, you felt the price was good. And third of all, you were satisfied. So you benefited, right? Did Albertsons benefit?
Yes. Of course they
Did anybody get involved in that?
No.
That's it. That's it. And every day you take this for granted, but this is what you're doing. You have nobody in between. Now, when you get to protectionism or high tariffs, let's say, on different industries, you don't have that anymore. Price fixing, then you're going to get into different kinds of corruption too involved. And you don't have those choices anymore because with those high tariffs, you're going to pay more. All the steel that you're paying for is going to be more expensive.
That's right.
Yep.
Didn't you just describe supply and demand? And whenever you interfere on the supply side or the demand side,
absolutely,
you come away with an inequality.
Inequality. Now, let me tell you something. This book is a fabulous book. It was thrown out in 1920s, and they started to teach Karl Marx. Karl Marx is a failure formula. Karl Marx said competition is not good. That's what drives it. See, big business doesn't like competition because competition is tough. And when you meld the monopolies we've got today, which is not good, we don't want monopoly, but the monopolies we've got today is when government and big business get together.
We have that.
That's the GPP.
We do have that now.
That's what he's talking about back there, the GPP.
Right.
That's not good.
No, it's not.
You want to leave that. You want to leave that open. You want competition as much as you. Competition is very difficult. Very difficult. John D. Rockefeller,
He was
who did some very, very good things.
but also some very bad things.
Well, let me continue. He did some very good things. He came up with nothing. He was the wealthiest man that's ever lived in this country. He was worth in our day and age about $350 billion.
That's right.
Who's that?
John D. Rockefeller. He started as a nothing. He had absolutely nothing. He became wealthy on his own. In those days, in the 1800s, you didn't have an income tax. You didn't have the restrictions that you've got today. He became so powerful that in 1911 they hauled him before Congress, and they said that he had a monopoly and we want to break it up. Standard Oil. Did he have a monopoly?
He did.
Nope.
He didn't have a monopoly. He had 90% of the market, but he didn't have 100% of it. So they broke it up, and guess what happened?
They expanded.
He doubled his wealth. The Sherman Antitrust Act was no good. He doubled his wealth because we thought he had a monopoly, so the government entered in, and he was on the golf course, he was with a priest, and he gave the priest, he says, do you have a dime? The priest said, what do you need a dime for? He says, because that's what I'm going to be worth after I'm done with Congress. They were going to, because the idea in those days was big business is bad. Is that true? No, that's a fallacy. And by the way, monopoly, let it go until you're sure. Don't just break the thing up. Let it go until you're sure. You don't want a pure monopoly because that's not good for competition. But Marx said he doesn't believe in competition. That's not good. Private property rights is not good. Why is private property so important?
Motivation.
Motivation.
Yeah. Ownership.
Well, you have to be motivated, but you could be motivated without private property. You could live in an apartment and be motivated. Why is private property so important to the individual?
Because he has skin in the game.
He's got skin in the game?
He has a vested interest in it.
He has a vested interest in the future with private property.
Okay, and what does that private property represent?
His choice is his life.
And him. That's an inalienable right. The property you own is you. It's what you believe in. It's the pictures on the wall is your because you have a vested interest. The house you live in is because you want to live in that house. You picked the house. That's part of your being. See, that's important. Because when you take private property away, then what happens?
You don't care.
And by the way, you better be careful. Because that's happening. That's happening. You lose private property. That's an inalienable right. Now, when Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among those being life, that's an inalienable right, shouldn't be taken away, that's a God-given right, liberty, pursuit, not happiness, pursuit of it, in any way you want to do it. They had property in there, but they had to take it out because, how come?
Slavery.
Slavery. They had to take it out. Southern states. But property is a right that you have. Private property. Well, Marx said you shouldn't have that. Religion is the opiate of the people. You must have virtue in the society, or the society will be going. You must have that. Gail?
Ayn Rand, who was a devoted communist and then switched to capitalism, she accepted capitalism on the basis of what you're talking, except for one thing, and that was inherited wealth. What do you do with inherited wealth?
What's wrong with that?
Well, inherited wealth is very important. Ayn Rand was also, she was on the order of an atheist or agnostic.
That's right.
And I just got done reading the talk in Atlas Shrugged that John Galt gave. By the way, I recommend, I'm glad Gail brought this up, I recommend you watch this Atlas Shrugged, the 3-part series. It's very good. But Ayn Rand left out the part that's so very important of the Supreme Creator, Supreme Being, the Almighty God. You have to have that in the equation. You cannot take that out of the equation because the inalienable rights come from God, and if you have a society that debauches itself, then what happens to the society? Adam Smith said, one of the 4 things that governments must do, and they are not doing it, by the way, is protect the populace against debauchery. Well, what in the world is that?
It's the government.
No, What's debauchery?
Immoral acts.
Well, what specifically was he talking about? Well, it's the tremendous, it's the exploitation of the vices. The vices would be the tremendous drug trade, the prostitution, the gambling, the organized gambling that goes in, the pornography. We got enough pornography in our in the system in America to drown it. Organized crime is in back of all that. This is very bad. The culture, if you lose the culture, and then the alcohol too, that there was a mistake made in Prohibition. Prohibition was a good idea. It needed to be juggled a little bit, and it wasn't. But if you allow the society to be debauched, what good is the Constitution or the Declaration? They don't mean anything anymore, because you've got a debauched society. So they have to guard against that, and we're not doing a very good job of that. We're pumping into the young people. The poison that's being pumped into the system is more than a civilized society can almost take. That's got to stop somewhere. So otherwise you're going to lose all of these other great freedoms that you have. You can't be doing that. Well, now, let me go into the next step here. Is Mary here? Yeah, Mary. I'm glad Mary's still awake. You come over here. I'm going to show you something. A discussion between Milton Friedman and Phil Donahue.
Oh, so you don't want to show
That
this
was a
one?
good one.
No, I don't want to show this yet. I want to show the
What's it called?
greed. Right there. Nope, above that. Yeah. And listen to the summum bonum of what we are as humans and what we should be doing.
When you see around the globe the maldistribution of wealth, the desperate plight of millions of people in underdeveloped countries, when you see so few haves and so many have-nots, when you see the greed and the concentration of power within, did you ever have a moment of doubt about capitalism and whether greed's a good idea to run on?
Well, first of all, tell me, is there some society you know that doesn't run on greed? You think Russia doesn't run on greed? You think China doesn't run on greed? What is greed? Of course, none of us are greedy. It's only the other fellow who's greedy. The world runs on individuals pursuing their separate interests. The great achievements of civilization have not come from government bureaus. Einstein didn't construct his theory under order from a bureaucrat. Henry Ford didn't revolutionize the automobile industry that way. In the only cases in which the masses have escaped from the kind of grinding poverty you're talking about, the only cases in recorded history are where they have had capitalism and largely free trade. If you want to know where the masses are worst off, it's exactly in the kinds of societies that depart from that. So that the record of history is absolutely crystal clear that there is no alternative way so far discovered of improving the lot of the ordinary people that can hold a candle to the productive activities that are unleashed by a free enterprise system.
So it seems to reward not virtue as much as ability to manipulate the system.
And what does reward virtue? You think a communist commissar rewards virtue? You think a Hitler rewards virtue? You think, excuse me, if you'll pardon me, do you think American presidents reward virtue? Do they choose their appointees on the basis of the virtue of the people appointed or on the basis of their political clout? Is it really true that political self-interest is nobler somehow than economic self-interest? You know, I think you're taking a lot of things for granted. And just tell me where in the world you find these angels who are going to organize society for us. Well, I don't even trust you to do that.
Okay, lights. Let me tell you something.
Donahue was stumped, wasn't he?
He was stumped. He came, but he had to learn from this. Let me tell you something. This is not utopia here. This is your self-interest. You want to be a teacher? Good. Be one. Be the best teacher you can. You want to be a corporate giant? Be one. Be free to be. You want to be an operator of a small business, or a candlestick maker, or a baker, whatever you want to be and whatever you think is important to you, do it, and do it well. But I want to tell you something. Economic self-interest is very important. And this mantra that's gone on for over 100 years, that we're going to soak the rich, is a lie. And we've got to stop doing that. Because is your property any less sacred or more than somebody that has a lot of money? You've got the same opportunity. I was telling you about a Rockefeller. Anybody can be a Rockefeller if they want to try to, but not everybody wants to be. Because money isn't the beginning and the end of everything. But he had an opportunity. He did it. You can do it. And why is his wealth that he made any less sacred than somebody who bakes bread at 4 o'clock in the morning? You can't be doing that and saying, well, we're going to soak them. We've been trying this for hundreds of years now. You saw in the film with Robert Owen. That's a failure formula. It does not work. We tried it here in America, didn't work. We keep going after it because the system of government that we set up requires, first of all, requires no envy. You can't look at somebody else and say, I'm going to take their money. What does that do for you? It doesn't do anything for you. What this system requires is everybody pulling their weight and pulling the wagon. But now what we have is a very large welfare state that we didn't have. We didn't have this in the early 1900s. And the welfare state, look, you've got to give a helping hand up to people, but not this way. This isn't the way, and it's particularly not the way the Founding Fathers envisioned it. And I'll tell you what they envisioned. Go ahead.
The millionaire,
Yes.
The book, The Millionaire Mind, where they went and interviewed thousands of millionaires.
Yeah.
The number one virtue they had was honesty. And there is a business here in town that repairs cars. They're booked solid because they never cheat anybody.
Well, see,
and that's what real free enterprises, that the very best will rise to the top. Yeah, you're going to go to that seedy person that, you know, cheats you on your weights and measures, maybe once or twice, but eventually you're going to find the consumer. We'll go after those that are honest in their
yes,
business.
and they'll we. Now that's like the teachers too. That's like teachers. If you had a system of instruction that the parents could decide who the teachers are that they want, you'd ferret all that out. Just like she's saying, you'd ferret all that out because the parents who would be the most knowledgeable will take their children, if they had a choice, to the teachers that they feel are the best, and so you weed out the other teachers that aren't the best. Now, as far as this, you have to be honest, but there's something in the universe that's been set up that says if everyone is free to make their own decisions how they want to buy things and consume things, there is an invisible hand that somehow has an operation that allows the society to move up. You're not penalizing people that make money. You're allowing this system to go, and my goodness gracious, we allowed it to go in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and I want to tell you right now, in our history, that period of capitalism was so unbelievable. Yes, there were disparities that had to be taken care of. Yes, there were sweatshops. We have all that. We were moving forward, and we were trying to take care of those things. There's no utopia. You've got to work through those things. But that period of time was so dynamic that in 1905, we were producing half of the goods in the world and consuming them too. It was incredible for the landmass that we had. And not only that, not only was there no unemployment, no lack of employment, I should say, but we were advertising overseas. Come to America, we don't have enough workers here. That thing was was absolutely explosive. We were just, it was just unbelievable when you let that thing go. Well, let me tell you something. And I need to get to a very important book. But first, let's see, where is it? Here it is. I need to get to this, because none of you have read it, and none of you have heard of it.
Depends on what it is.
See, I know a lot. I've read it. You need to know about this book. A Caveat Against Injustice. Well, what's this thing all about? Well, Das Kapital and the Communist Manifesto, there's over 500,000 copies of those in the United States. In the 1920s, there were some industrialists, some academicians, and some radical thinkers, particularly anarchists, and those involved in the labor movement that were radicals, lost faith in the doctrines not only of the Founding Fathers, but they lost faith in Adam Smith. They thought he was outdated. Doesn't work anymore, so now we're going to teach Marx. Well, they started putting Marx in the colleges, and they started de-emphasizing Adam Smith. And the doctrine of Marx is a failure formula. It does not work. Adam Smith's doctrine gave us the late 1890s and the early 1900s. Now, this book is an inquiry into the evils of a fluctuating medium of exchange. There's 2 copies of this, original copies in the United States. This is, of course, not an original. But there's 2 original copies. Do you know who wrote this book? Now, you've had a lot of theories. You've seen Milton Friedman over there. And I want to show iPencil, and then we're going to end up with Walker, too.
What's the title?
This is called A Caveat Against Injustice. You know who wrote this?
When was it written?
Now, I told you that there's 500,000 copies of Communist Manifesto out there. It's studied. Das Kapital is out there. But there's only a couple of copies of this, and this is not studied. Who wrote this? Anybody know? It was Roger Sherman. Boy, what a great reader you are. Roger, well, who's he? Who's Roger Sherman? All right, now let me tell you something. Roger Sherman is one of our founding fathers that signed 4 documents. He's the only one that signed 4 major documents in the United States. Because of Roger Sherman at the Constitutional Convention, we have 2 senators from each state. That was the compromise, and he made it. Okay? Very few people know what this man did. He signed the Continental Association, which in 1774 was a major document that said we are now going to rise up. In the Continental Congress, they said, we're now going to rise up against the British. We're going to put our stake down. That's enough of this. They just slaughtered our people in Massachusetts. They're doing all kinds of things. So he signed that document. Then he signed the Declaration of Independence. He was there. In 1776, he signed that. He signed the Articles of Confederation, which was, John Dickinson actually wrote that. But he signed that in 1776, right around that area, too. And then he signed the Constitution. He was at the Constitutional Convention. He's the only one that signed all 4 of those documents. He's the one who, now you have all these theorists. You got Milton Friedman, you got Bastiat, who wrote a book called The Law. You have, somebody mentioned Keynes. You have Samuelson. You have Ricardo, Ludwig von Mises, all these economists, not one of them. Not a one of them had to serve in a legislative body and convince the others of his argument. This man did. And because of Roger Sherman, we have Article 1, Section 10. What's that say? What's Article 1, Section 10?
Well, Article 1 is legislature, so it's
Legislative, that's right.
so section what? Section 10?
Article 1, Section 10.
I think you gave us a hint about the senators. Aren't they appointed by the...
No, that's, you're thinking of the 17th Amendment. Article 1, Section 10, I'll read it to you. You know what it is?
I can read it to you.
Yes. Yes, wait a minute. I want to get there, so I want to follow you.
Make sure I read it right.
Because Article 1, Section 10, and I want the first clause.
Just the first clause?
Yes, I want the first clause.
No state shall enter into any treaty, alliance, or confederation, grant letters of marque and reprisal, coin money, emit bills of credit, make anything but gold and silver coin a tender in payment of debt.
Stop right there. That's Roger Sherman. Gold and silver coin in payment of debts. See, that's honest money. What we're doing now is this is dishonest. That's Roger Sherman. He's the one who put that in there because he's from Connecticut, and they were using emitting bills of credit. They were no good. Caused inflation, and they almost went under because of it. He wrote this, and I want to tell you, this is a great man. Are they studying this in the colleges? No. This is what we need to study. Not Das Kapital, not the Communist Manifesto. We need to study this from the man who was there, who knew what he was talking about. And Thomas Jefferson said about Roger Sherman, he never said a foolish thing in his life. How do you like that? That's a great man. But we don't know much about him today. We don't talk about him very much. Here's the description of him by Major William Pierce, who wrote about the characters in the Constitutional Convention. Pierce was from Georgia, and he wrote this about Roger Sherman. He wrote about every delegate to the Constitutional Convention. This is what he wrote about Sherman. Mr. Sherman exhibits the oddest shaped character I ever remember to have met with. He's very, very awkward. He was awkward, unmeaning, and unaccountably strange in his manner. But in his train of thinking, there is something regular, deep, and comprehensive. Yet the oddity of his address, the vulgarisms that accompany his public speaking, and that strange New England cant which runs through his public and private speaking, make everything that is connected with him grotesque and laughable. Now, listen. And yet, he deserves infinite praise. No man has a better heart or a clearer head. If he cannot embellish, he can furnish thoughts that are wise and useful. He is an able politician and extremely artful in accomplishing any particular object. It is remarked that he seldom fails. Now let me just tell you something before we go on to a few other things that Mary, is Mary still around? Oh good, she's still here. If it hadn't been for Roger Sherman, the small states would have left the Constitutional Convention, and guess what? You have no Constitution. But he made a grand compromise on representation. He's the one who came up with the formula for the Senate, the upper house. Because, remember, Madison wanted everything on a vote. But the small states were going to leave. And if the small states leave, you don't have a country. So he kept the thing together. Now, let me just say this. I want to show you something. Mary, where are you now? Okay. We're going to look at a pencil. I want to show you how a pencil is put together without prejudice, without bias, without knowing who put it together. We're not interested in how you feel about this country or that country. I want to show you this. This is called, the actual thing is called iPencil. But, yes.
Look at this lead pencil. There's not a single person in the world who could make this pencil. Remarkable statement? Not at all. The wood from which it's made, for all I know, comes from a tree that was cut down in the state of Washington. To cut down that tree, it took a saw. To make the saw, it took steel. To make the steel, it took iron ore. This black center, we call it lead, but it's really graphite, compressed graphite. I'm not sure where it comes from, but I think it comes from some mines in South America. This red top up here, the eraser, bit of rubber, probably comes from Malaya, where the rubber tree isn't even native. It was imported from South America by some businessmen with the help of the British government. This brass ferrule, I haven't the slightest idea where it came from, or the yellow paint, or the paint that made the black lines, or the glue that holds it together. Literally thousands of people cooperated to make this pencil. People who don't speak the same language, who practice different religions, who might hate one another if they ever met. When you go down to the store and buy this pencil, you are in effect trading a few minutes of your time for a few seconds of the time of all those thousands of people. What brought them together and induced them to cooperate to make this pencil? There was no commissar sending out orders from some central office. It was a magic of the price system, the impersonal operation of prices that brought them together and got them to cooperate to make this pencil so that you could have it for a trifling sum. That is why the operation of the free market is so essential, not only to promote productive efficiency, but even more, to foster harmony and peace among the peoples of the world.
That's right.
Wow.
Okay, let's get that off. All right. Hey, look. This is the invisible. This is amazing. You let that thing go, and you've got all of these various countries putting a pencil together, and who knows who, look, there's never going to be no prejudice. That's not going to happen. It never has happened. You're going to have that. You've got racism in the world. You don't want to institutionalize it. Racism is bad enough, but you don't want to make it institutionalized. And we've done that a couple times. But this is amazing, because the price system will, if it's allowed to work properly, will foster harmony and peace throughout the world. That's the bottom line of this. Now, we've got just a little bit more time, and I want to, I have 5 hours more of stuff left, but we're not going to do that. I want to show one more thing, where we are today, from the Comptroller of the United States from 1998 to 2008, David Walker, under the Clinton and the Bush administration. And then I want to wrap it up, and then everybody will be able to go. But we started a little bit late because Tom took too long. But anyhow, I want you to see from a guy who's right down the middle where we are today, because we've gotten off what's true, what works, and we've gone on a different path. And in the last 3 generations, we've taken enough cyanide to commit suicide. Now, I want to show you this, but if we get back, we can do it. Let's see this. This will take about a few minutes.
We are mortgaging the future of our children, grandchildren, future generations, while at the same time reducing relative investments in their future at a time that they're going to have increasing competition. That's not only irresponsible, it is immoral.
Former Comptroller of the United States of America.
Hi, I'm Nick Gillespie with Reason TV. Today we're talking to David Walker, the President and CEO of the Peter G. Peterson Foundation and former U.S. Comptroller General. David, thanks for talking.
Good to be with you, Nick.
You talk a lot about federal financial responsibility. What is the magnitude of the problem facing us in terms of fiscal responsibility or lack thereof?
Well, last year, fiscal 2009, we had a $1.42 trillion deficit. This year, it's going to be $1.3 trillion plus. The debt has more than doubled in the last 10 years. It's scheduled to more than double again in the next 10. The total liabilities...
Isn't that kind of growth good?
That type of growth is not. That's called negative growth. And you know, our liabilities and unfunded promises have tripled in the last 10 years as well.
What are the major drivers of this out-of-control government liabilities?
Medicare is $38 trillion underwater. Social Security is $7 to $8 trillion underwater. Those would be the two biggest.
What are the types of spending restraints that are meaningful that we might put in, or Congress might put in on itself? And then how do we save, or not necessarily save, how do we make Social Security and Medicare either less horrible disasters or more viable going?
Well, first, we need to learn from the past. We need to reimpose tough statutory budget controls on discretionary spending. We need to be able to have mandatory reconsideration of spending programs and tax policies when they reach a certain size.
Okay, what does that
Well, what that means is under the past spending controls that we had, we controlled what was called discretionary spending, which is defense and other spending, but we didn't have any controls at all that over 60% of the budget that there's in there by law that are the mandatory spending programs. Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, agricultural programs, $1 trillion worth of tax preferences, deductions, exemptions, exclusions, credits. Those just grew on autopilot, weren't subject to any constraint or any oversight. We also need to have pay-as-you-go rules that are real meaningful pay-as-you-go rules. The ones that are there right now have trillions of gaps in them.
Here's speaking of pay-go, President Obama has said, you know what, we're not going to spend a dime unless we're cutting a dime. One of the recent issues.
Okay, let's just wrap this up. This generation of Americans, these young people, some of them are here tonight, they are going to have a burden to save the country. We have gone in the opposite direction, and we need to look back and look what was successful and not veer and have people with iron rods up their spines that can stick in there and say, this is what's right and this is the way we're going to go. Because where we're going now is to hell. And we need to reverse what we have done here. And the only way to reverse that is for an understanding of the moorings of the institutions and traditions of this country. And if we get away from that, it is not a success formula. We got to go back to success formula because this nation has been blessed by God. And we've got to remember that. God bless America. We'll see you next week.
Thank you.